Steel rusts the color of dried blood beneath a canopy that was never planted by human hands. Somewhere beneath the brambles, a single track still glints when the afternoon light hits it just right, a thin silver vein running through 10 miles of wilderness that 80 years ago did not exist at all. Step closer and the air changes. It smells of crushed nettle, of damp bark, of something sweet and rotting and alive all at once. A kestrel watches from a signal post, long since stripped of its purpose. Below it, in the gravel bed where trains once thundered past at 60 miles an hour, an orchid blooms, a flower so rare that botanists once needed a permit just to whisper its name. This is not a forest that grew by accident. It is a forest that grew because humans simply stopped trying. There is a question worth sitting with before we go any further. What happens to a landscape the moment we turn our backs on it? Not when we destroy it, we know that story all too well, but when we abandon it, when we walk away and let silence do the work that bulldozers and chemicals never could. The answer, as it turns out, is stranger and more beautiful than almost anyone expected, and it began, of all places, with the slow death of an industry built on speed. In the middle of the 20th century, railways were the arteries of the modern world. Steel lines stitched together coal towns and ports, cities and quarries, carrying the raw muscle of industrial civilization across continents in a haze of coal smoke and steam. But empires built on combustion rarely last forever. As roads widened and freight moved to trucks, as coal mines closed and factories fell silent, thousands of miles of railway simply became unnecessary, not destroyed, not demolished, just left. Left the way a wound is left to heal once the bleeding stops. Picture the moment the last train ever passed down one such line. No ceremony, no witnesses, save perhaps a farmer in a distant field who barely looked up. The rails went quiet. The signal lights flickered once more and died. And for the first time in nearly a century, nothing artificial moved along that corridor of crushed stone and cinder. Within days, something extraordinary began. Wind-blown seeds, dandelion, willow herb, ragwort, drifted into the gravel and found, against all expectation, exactly the conditions they needed to thrive. Because here is the secret almost no one anticipated. Railway beds, those scars we assumed were dead zones, were in fact strange accidental sanctuaries. The crushed stone ballast that once cradled the tracks drains water with brutal efficiency, starving out the aggressive, water-hungry grasses that dominate ordinary soil. What thrives instead are the specialists, the drought-tolerant, the rare. Ecologists have a term for habitats like this. They call them brownfield refugia, scraps of post-industrial land that, paradoxically, support more biodiversity than the pristine countryside around them. It sounds almost like a joke nature is playing on us. We spend a century building something to move coal and steel as fast as possible, and the moment we stop, the very wreckage of that ambition becomes one of the most fertile habitats on the continent. Within 5 years, the abandoned line was unrecognizable. Buddleia, the so-called butterfly bush, had colonized the old platforms, its purple spires drawing in clouds of red admirals and peacocks that pulsed like heartbeats against the grey brick. Brambles wove themselves into the embankments, offering both food and fortress to nesting wrens. And beneath it all, hidden from casual eyes, the soil itself was quietly transforming. Decades of coal dust and clinker had left it lean and mineral poor, and lean soil, strange as it sounds, is a gift to wildflowers. Rich soil breeds dominance, poor soil breeds diversity. The strong cannot choke out the weak when there is barely enough to go around, and so 100 modest species find room to coexist where one aggressive species would otherwise win everything. Is it possible that scarcity, the very thing we fear most, is sometimes the architect of abundance? By the second decade, orchids had arrived, bee orchids first, their petals mimicking the very insects meant to pollinate them, an evolutionary sleight of hand 20 million years in the making. Then came the pyramidal orchids, the southern marsh orchids, species so particular about their conditions that conservationists spend small fortunes trying to recreate similar habitats elsewhere, often without success. No one planted them here. No one could have planned this. They simply found a forgotten strip of broken stone and, against every expectation, called it home. Foxes moved in next, denning beneath collapsed signal boxes where rust-furred kits tumbled over coils of abandoned cable. Badgers excavated their sets into embankments once engineered by Victorian surveyors, their tunnels running parallel to tunnels of an entirely different purpose dug a century before. And somewhere in the tangled canopy that had crept over old bridges, bats began to roost in the brickwork. Pipistrelles mostly, slipping out at dusk to drink the insect-thick air above the rotting sleepers. What makes this transformation almost impossible to comprehend is the corridor itself, its sheer linear continuity. A conventional nature reserve is an island, cut off, isolated, genetically marooned, but a disused railway line is not an island at all. It is a thread, often running for dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles, connecting fragments of habitat that would otherwise never touch. A hedgehog born in one woodland can travel the length of a county along this corridor without ever crossing open, exposed ground. A dormouse can disperse its genes across a landscape fractured by motorways and monoculture fields, simply by following the ghost of a railway that hasn't carried a single passenger since the 1960s. Ecologists call these wildlife corridors, and for decades they have been considered one of the most valuable and most difficult assets in conservation. Difficult to build, expensive to maintain. And yet here, scattered across the world, lie thousands of miles of them already built, already aged into maturity, requiring nothing from us but the discipline not to interfere. There is something almost unbearably poetic in that. We spent fortunes engineering these lines to serve one purpose, and in their failure, in their obsolescence, they have come to serve a purpose infinitely more vital, not moving cargo, but moving life itself. Consider for a moment the German railway sidings of the Ruhr Valley, where heavy industry once blackened the sky for 100 years. When the steel mills finally closed in the late 20th century, ecologists expected toxic wastelands and found instead astonishing oases. Researchers there documented over 100 bird species and more than 700 plant species recolonizing former industrial rail yards, many of them rare or endangered elsewhere. The soil, contaminated with heavy metals in places, had become so hostile to ordinary vegetation that only the rarest, most specialized plants could survive, turning toxicity itself into an accidental filter for biodiversity. Nature, it seems, does not need pristine conditions to thrive. It needs only the absence of our constant, well-meaning interference. That single fact should unsettle every assumption we hold about conservation. We have spent generations believing that saving nature means actively managing it, fencing it, planting it, curating it, according to our own aesthetic of what wilderness should look like. But these abandoned lines suggest something far more humbling. Sometimes the most powerful conservation strategy available to us is to simply leave. And yet, leaving is, for our species, perhaps the hardest thing we know how to do. There is a particular stretch. Let us walk it together, if only in imagination, where an old railway bridge crosses what was once a canal, now a still black ribbon choked with water lilies. Stand on that bridge at dusk. Listen. You will hear the percussive clatter of a moorhen disturbed somewhere in the reeds. You will hear, if you are patient, the high, thin needle call of a pipistrelle bat just at the edge of human hearing. You will smell creosote, faint and ghostly, still clinging to sleepers that have not borne a train in 60 years. The chemical memory of an industrial age, slowly being absorbed back into the soil it once tried to dominate. Stand there long enough and you begin to understand something that no textbook quite captures. Time, given freely and without interruption, is the single most powerful force in ecology. Not technology, not funding, not even good intentions. Time. It took roughly 40 years for some of these corridors to develop the structural complexity of old-growth woodland edges. Multiple canopy layers, deadwood habitats, established fungal networks threading silently beneath the soil, connecting root to root in a slow, invisible conversation we are only beginning to understand. Mycorrhizal fungi, we now know, can transport nutrients and even chemical warnings between trees across these networks. An underground internet older than language itself, rebuilding itself thread by thread beneath ground that was once compacted by the weight of steam locomotives. Is it not strange, then, that we measure progress by speed, by how quickly we can build, extract, expand, while the planet's own genius operates on a timescale we can barely perceive, patiently rebuilding what we abandoned, asking nothing of us but patience in return? Of course, not every story like this ends in triumph. Many disused railways were eventually repurposed, paved into cycle paths, redeveloped into housing, their fragile ecosystems erased before anyone fully understood what had grown there. Ecologists have, in more than one instance, fought desperately and unsuccessfully to have these corridors recognized and protected before bulldozers arrived to convert them, ironically, back into infrastructure. The very obscurity that allowed nature to flourish unnoticed is the same obscurity that leaves these places vulnerable, invisible to policy, absent from the maps that determine what gets saved and what gets sacrificed. This is the quiet tragedy hidden inside the quiet triumph. The places best suited to heal are so often the places we value least, until, almost too late, we begin to understand what we nearly destroyed twice. In recent years, something has shifted. Conservation groups in Britain, in Germany, in parts of the United States, have begun formally mapping these disused corridors, recognizing them not as wasteland awaiting development, but as functioning, irreplaceable habitat. Some have been granted protected status. Others have been deliberately left to continue their slow, unscripted recovery, monitored but untouched, studied but unmanaged. There is a particular kind of restraint required to protect something by doing nothing to it, and that restraint, more than any grand restoration project, may be the most radical conservation idea of our time. Because here is the deeper truth hiding inside this story of rust and orchids and foxes denning in old signal boxes. We have spent the last 2 centuries operating under an unspoken assumption that wild places are wild because we put them there, fenced them, designated them, declared them sacred by decree. But these railway lines tell a different story entirely. They tell us that wildness is not something we create. It is something that returns patiently, persistently, the moment we stop standing in its way. What does it mean then to truly let go? Not to abandon something out of neglect, but to release it deliberately, trusting a process larger and older and wiser than our own intentions. We are a species addicted to control, to planting the right tree in the right place, to managing every variable, to believing that nature requires our supervision in order to flourish. And yet here, in 10 miles of forgotten steel and stone, life rebuilt an entire ecosystem more diverse than most of the landscapes we actively curate, simply because no one was watching closely enough to interfere. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson embedded in every weed pushing through every crack of broken concrete, in every orchid rooted in cinder, in every fox curled asleep beneath a rusted signal box that once governed the movement of 100 trains a day. Perhaps wildness was never something we needed to build. Perhaps it was only ever waiting, patient, indifferent to our plans, ready to return the instant we remembered how to step aside. Somewhere tonight, beneath a canopy no one planted, on a track no train will ever travel again, an owl will call across ground once shaken by the weight of industry. And the silence that follows that call will not be empty. It will be full of fungal threads whispering nutrients between roots, full of orchids holding their shape in darkness, full of a slow, deliberate, magnificent rebuilding that asks nothing of us except the one thing we find hardest to give: stillness, and the humility to understand that sometimes the most profound act of creation is simply to walk away and let the world remember, on its own terms, how to become wild again.